It's Elise. Today I wanted to talk about how to teach a complete beginner on flute. When we first start teaching, a lot of times these are the kinds of students we'll get. They've never ever played their flute before, they've never made a sound, and I feel like this can be a challenge to teach. For me personally, it used to make me really nervous because when I first learned the flute, I didn't actually have any direction. There was like me and a group of girls that wanted to learn to play the flute, and they just sort of gave us a pile of flutes and they were like, here you go, figure it out, which is not a good way to learn the flute. Anyway, that first day, I wasn't able to make any sound. I didn't have any help. So I think I always had this fear that my students would have the same experience. I've been teaching for about 10 years, and fortunately that has never actually happened. So I think I have a pretty good idea now of how to direct someone to make that initial sound. I was actually even able to teach my daughter, who's 3, to make a few little sounds. So today I'm going to talk about how you can teach a complete beginner to play the flute that has never made any sound before. I'm just going to sort of outline what I normally do in that first lesson. So you've met your student and now they're sitting down, they've got their flute, and the first thing I do is explain to them which side is up and which side is down on your instrument. We sort of take this for granted once we've been playing for a while, but it's very important that they don't dump the flute out the very first time they open their instrument, okay? So just show them, like, based on the latch. Usually beginner flutes have a different kind of latch, but show them which side is up and which side is down. And just explain that you don't want to drop the flute out of the case when you first open it. So once they've opened the case, I just briefly introduce the instrument, say the head joint, body, foot, and then we may put it together. I sort of judge their patience. If I think that they can wait to put the flute together, then I will wait and just have them start on the head joint. If I think they're really itching to put it together first, then I will just show them quickly how to put it together and how to line it up. But even if they do put it all together, the first thing I do is still just start with the head joint. They don't get to blow on the whole flute. So I just spend a few minutes introducing the instrument, and then I go straight into sound production because I think that's the most fun and also most difficult part. I just taught a first flute lesson online yesterday, and do be sure, if you're teaching online, that they are putting this in the right direction, okay? Because it's kind of hard to tell sometimes on the camera which side is right and which side is left. So I just had her hold up her right hand so I could make sure that the flute was pointing the right direction. So once we've got the head joint out, the first thing I talk about is the air. I always like to explain that the air is what makes the sound, not any sort of facial thing. Because I think beginners can get really caught up on how this looks, but really what they need to focus on is blowing enough. So after I say that, then I will show them where to place the flute on their face. So I like to tell them that this back edge of the flute right here is gonna go right at the bottom of the lip, so where your lip and your chin meet. So this might take a little bit of experimentation for them to find, and if you're teaching an in-person lesson, I do recommend having a mirror there so they can actually see themselves, because they just won't be able to tell by feeling at first. If you're doing an online lesson, of course, they can look at their own camera and make sure that they're putting it in the right spot. So if you got your flute in the right spot and you know that it's all about the air, all you have to do is blow. And I just demonstrate that for them so they can hear what it's supposed to sound like. And then I let them try a few times and watch what happens. Sometimes that direction alone will be enough, but oftentimes they will need a few corrections. Some common things that I see happen is that they will roll the flute in too far, so they'll be covering the hole a little bit too much, and they may not understand, so you may have to explain that the air needs to go across the hole, not in the hole. Okay, so that's really important because when you're a beginner flute player, you don't really understand how the sound is actually made, and that actually took me a long time to understand. So you may need to explain to roll the flute out and make sure they know what that means, rolling it away from their face. And they may also be sort of ducking their chin, so to lift their chin up. not like way up, not sticking it out, just like at a normal angle. So that's one issue, is that the angle of the air is not correct. And then the other common issue will be that they just don't have enough airspeed. You can correct this by asking them to take a big, slow breath, because a beginner flute player won't know how to take those big breaths that we practice. So you can demonstrate how to take a big breath and let them try again. So if they still need more airspeed, they just may need to blow harder. And this I will have them do just away from the flute, and I'll demonstrate that they really need to really blow hard. Which, when you watch a flute player that's practiced, it doesn't look like they're blowing really hard, but that's just because they're used to it. So I will show them that they need to blow like they're really exasperated, or like mad or something, right? So there has to be a lot of energy behind that air. Then I'll let them try that, see if it helps. A lot of times that will make a big difference, and that will be just what they need to make that first sound. If it still seems like there's not enough air, I will also be paying attention to their embouchure to see if maybe the hole is too large, because if they have too large of an aperture in their embouchure, the air just won't be able to come out fast enough. So then I will direct them to basically just close their lips and let the air push them open. And a lot of times then I will show them what mine looks like when I play, so they can see like the hole is really small. When we're working with the head joint, I'll also show them the general action of their face muscles. So I like to explain it almost like a whistle, and I'll show them this face, and I'll have them do it too, which is like, so their lips are pulling forward rather than back and smiling, because sometimes flutists will do like a pulling back thing, and that will actually get them the sound out at first, but that's not the correct embouchure, and I think it's really going to be helpful to them if you correct them at the beginning rather than years later. So I will show them this face and have them mimic me, so that they get the feeling of those muscles being engaged. One other thing that I sometimes see with a new flute player is that they will try to move their lips and blow at the same time. So it'll be like, so they'll be like forming the embouchure as they're blowing. So again, I'll show them that face and make sure that they make the embouchure before they start blowing, so that the whole setup of the sound production is there before the air starts moving. So in this order, they'll put the flute under their lip, they'll make their embouchure, or pull their lips forward, or whistle, however you explain it, and then take a deep breath and blow. Again, I sort of like to drip feed this information so that they don't get bombarded with directions. Besides, they may not need all of those directions, so I try to just give them what they need. Again, initially, I will tell them air makes the sound and where to put the flute. Then I let them try, and I will give them more directions based on what I see them doing. Each time I'll give them just one direction and then let them try that and see if it helps. I like to have them practice a really long sound first, so whatever the first sound is great, it's fine. Make sure you praise them when they get that first tone out, because that is the first step towards developing consistency in their sound, is just to get a sound. Once they've gotten that a few times, I'll ask them to play a longer sound. So just as long as they can. At this point, most young flutists will be anxious to get their whole flute together, so I will try to judge their capacity for patience with this head joint exercise, because some flutists will be really anxious to get the whole flute together. If they have patience, I will encourage them to get a consistent sound out of the head joint, and make sure to reassure them as they're doing this that it's totally normal for the sound to be inconsistent at first. Sometimes once they get the sound out once, they think it should just come out every time, but that's just not going to happen for someone on their very first day of playing the flute. If they're getting tired or a little bit frustrated and you don't feel like they're ready to move on to the whole instrument, you can just stop them and talk to them a little bit, remind them of the directions you've given them to produce sound. And I will usually have them repeat those back to me. So I'll say, okay, what do we need to think about? And, have those simple and clear directions for them to repeat back to me. So that when they go on their own to practice, they'll have these clear directions in their mind. I will stop them and talk to them for like a minute, give them a little physical break, and then have them try again. Each student's natural abilities and patience will vary. So while I do basically say the same directions at a first lesson, the pacing will vary depending on the student. I try to make all of the directions that I give to the student very clear and simple so that it's easy for them to remember when they go to practice their instrument on their own. And I will remind them of these directions over and over and over throughout the lesson. So in particular, those two things that I mentioned at the very beginning of the lesson, which is air produces the sound, so take a deep breath, and where to place the flute on their face. I feel like sound production is the hardest part of the flute to teach, and if you're an experienced flutist but a new teacher, it might be kind of hard for you to explain at first. But I do think that this is the area that you can help the student with the most. Most students will be able to eventually read a fingering chart and memorize fingerings all by themselves. And at that first lesson, they don't really need to learn a bunch of fingerings. That's not going to help them. What the student's really going to need help with is the sound production. So I do spend most of the time in the first lesson focused on that, and most of it is just with the head joint. If the student wants to do a little bit more head joint work, you can also have them do repeated attacks on the note. So like breath attacks, I explain it as like panting or laughing, or like hoo, 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 right? So it sounds like, and it gives more opportunities for them to find and experiment with their embouchure. Once they've gotten a few sounds out or run out of patience with the head joint, we'll put the whole flute together and I'll show them how it lines up and how to even hold the flute so that they don't bend the keys. Just explaining how the bar right here lines up with the center of the key, and that this embouchure hole lines up with the first key. Basically, that's how it should be lined up. Then I'll show them where the fingers go on their keys. Make sure that they're skipping that key right there. This will be very awkward at first for your student, and especially uncomfortable for students with smaller bodies. I don't usually actually spend that much time with the whole flute at the first lesson because I feel like it's a little bit too difficult. But because most students want to put the whole flute together, mess with the keys, I do let them do that a little bit. I like to start with a note that is easy to hold on the flute and also easy to produce the sound. So I tend to choose G. It's also easy to explain the fingerings. Basically, this whole hand is down plus the pinky, right? I'll be sure to remind them of the directions I was giving them when they were just on the head joint. Then I just let them blow that. So I'll usually demonstrate so they can, again, hear the sound and hear the pitch. So you'll probably also need to troubleshoot this. A lot of times, transitioning from just the head joint to the whole flute is not going to be that smooth. Make sure that their position is correct for sound production, and then double check their fingers. So if you are hearing basically the correct pitch and it's just windy, like a, then you know that it's just something over here. They probably need to just blow harder and they'll get the sound out. If you're hearing something with the wrong harmonics in the sound, so like, then they probably have a fingering issue. So when they're first playing the flute, they may not be fully pressing down the keys. So make sure that they know that it has to be fully closed. And then the other thing I see beginner flutists, because they don't have the sensitivity in their fingers, they may slightly tap these trill keys, one or two of them, and that of course will make the sound not come out, right? You'll have like a, if they get a tone out. If they tap these trill keys even a little bit, the sound won't come out correctly. Each student will have different amounts of success on the whole flute, and you'll just have to sort of judge how your student is reacting to this whole experience. Generally, this will be hard and it will be very difficult for them to find the sound again with the whole flute. So I'll take the head joint back off and we'll just walk back through all of the directions that I gave them with just the head joint. We'll do the same thing, play long sounds, and just make sure this is all working properly before we then go back. So I'll do a lot of back and forth between the head joint and the whole flute in that first lesson. If they get to the point where they can consistently produce sound, or they just seem ready to learn another note, then I'll do A. Then I'll have them do the same sorts of exercises on A so they can play long sounds and then the short repeated sounds. If they've got G and A and a pretty consistent sound, I'll then let them alternate back and forth between those two notes. So something like so they get the feeling of moving their fingers around. If they seem even ready to go beyond that, I'll add B, same thing, and I'll let them alternate between B and A, and then maybe all three notes. What's cool about learning those three notes, G, A, B, is that then you can start learning a couple of little songs, right? So like Hot Cross Buns, you can do sort of a version of Mary Had a Little Lamb. But usually I won't get into this in the first lesson. That would be pretty rare that we get that far. Most first lessons, I like to just focus on the sound production, and that alone is enough for a student to practice. So for learning all of that, generally the student doesn't really actually need a book for that first lesson, but sometimes they like to have a book, and it can be useful for them to at least have that fingering chart that's going to be in that beginner flute book. I like to pick a book that has some pictures of what their embouchure should look like in particular, because I feel like that's really useful to have as a reference. Most beginning flute books will basically do the same thing, which is they'll teach you a few notes at the beginning, and most books will assume that your student doesn't know how to read music yet. Of course, it just depends on the student. Some students will already know how to read music if they play another instrument, or they might not. Learning to play the flute and learning to read music at the same time can be quite a challenge. This is the way I learned, because flute was my first instrument. Because there's so much to think about, the embouchure, the fingering, and then reading the notes and the rhythms, most of the time at the beginning, I will let them write in all the notes. Because for most beginning flutists that are also learning to read music at the same time, that will be more than enough challenge for them. You do want the student to have a positive first experience with the instrument, so I try to do my best to gauge when the student's getting impatient, and if they are, either take a short break or maybe switch to something a little bit different. It just depends, but I really prioritize giving them a positive first experience. So that means I will give them a lot of positive reinforcement when they get that first sound out. I will reassure them that they're doing great and that what they're experiencing with their first lesson is totally normal. So my beginning flute lessons will usually just be half an hour, and that will be way more than enough to fill up that time. Then I like to give them some directions on practicing and encourage them to practice every day. This is a big responsibility for a kid, so I try to make sure they know that it doesn't have to be long. It can be like 5 minutes, but just getting the instrument out and blowing on it a little bit every day is really what's going to get them to get more consistent on their sound. And that it'll be a lot more fun and they'll make more progress, and so it'll be a lot more fun and less frustrating if they practice more. I also say it's not a big deal if you miss a day here and there. You just want to sort of generally have a habit of practicing every day. A younger kid may not necessarily know how to make a new habit, so I'll tell them that they can attach it to something that they already do. So maybe after dinner, they get their flute out and blow on it for 5 minutes, or somehow attach it to a daily habit that they already have. And that way it becomes easier to remember and just something that becomes more automatic. Let me know if you have any questions about teaching a complete beginner flute player, or if you have any other techniques or ways you like to explain things to a new flute player. Leave me a comment below. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can also follow me on Instagram and on Facebook. If you want to have early access to all of my videos, you can also support me on Patreon for just $5 a month. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you next time. Bye!